friends, and open-minded people wherever you might live in the world. This is David Duke, and this is the David Duke Show on the Rinse Radio Network, which you can also always find, of course, at davidduke.com. Today I have a very special presentation to you of my introduction to my new book, The Secret Book Behind Communism. The subtitle of the book is The Ethnic Origins of the Russian Revolution and the Greatest Holocaust in the History of Mankind. The book begins with a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. You must understand, the leading Bolsheviks who took over Russia were not Russians. They hated Russians. They hated Christians. Driven by ethnic hatred, they tortured and slaughtered millions of Russians without a shred of human remorse. The October Revolution was not what you call in America the, quote, Russian Revolution. It was an invasion and conquest over the Russian people. More of my countrymen suffered horrific crimes at their blood-stained hands than any people or nation ever suffered in the entirety of human history. It cannot be overstated. Bolshevism committed the greatest human slaughter of all time. The fact that most of the world is ignorant and uncaring about this enormous crime is proof that the global media is in the hands of the perpetrators. That's from Nobel Prize winner Alexander Solzhenitsyn. These were startling words, spoken to me by the famous Russian writer and philosopher Alexander Solzhenitsyn when I had the privilege of meeting him in Moscow in 2002. His words made me fully realize the fact that most of the people of the world know little about the tribalist entity which created and drove the communist juggernaut that took over Russia. They know frighteningly little about the greatest slaughters in history, the genocide of tens of millions of people that was spawned by deep ethnic hatred. For many people, even some of those who have studied the Russian Revolution in history courses in universities around the world, this is the secret behind communism. This secret, even though it's plain to see if one just looks closely, is rarely spoken about in either the mainstream press or in mainstream academia. The revolution occurred in Russia, and although a percentage of Russians participated in it, it was not a Russian revolution. It was led by an alienated, non-Russian, Jewish ethnic minority who hated Russia, Russians, and the Tsar for their alleged anti-Semitism. Their fellow tribalists all over the world financed and supported and provided shock troops that executed the brutal takeover of the Russian government. Upon achieving total power, their deep, psychopathic, racist hatred against Russians became manifest in the greatest human slaughter of all time. Any historian who has studied modern communism from its ideological origins in Karl Marx and Moses Hess through the mass dispossession, forced starvations, and gulags of the 20th century is aware that communists are the real world champions of mass murder. There is no historical dispute about the fact that communist regimes killed many more times the number of innocents than any other regime in history, including Hitler's Germany. But unlike members of the National Socialist regime, the greatest mass murderers of all time have not been hunted down across the face of the earth. They've not faced trial for their horrific crimes against humanity. Perhaps even more importantly, they've never faced the court of popular revulsion. Why? It's because these communist perpetrators have been shielded by their tribal brethren who have an inordinate influence on media, academia, and in governments. The deaths in just one of the many communist killing fields totaled 5 to 8 million men, women, and children of the Ukraine who were starved, killed, imprisoned, and worked to death in what is today called the Holodomor. It totals a death number equal or even greater than the numbers in what today is called the Holocaust. Today, nearly every person on Earth, through mass media and government commemoration, is aware of and empathizes with the victims of the Holocaust. But 99% of humanity are completely unaware of the Ukrainian Holodomor. The world has been inundated with both fictional and non-fictional dramas about the suffering of Jews and Jewish children, such as Anne Frank in the war. However, the great masses have not been led to shed tears for the little girls of Ukrainian and Russian heritage who suffered and died. They are unknown, unremembered, and unmourned in the media of today. People are unconscious and cut off from empathy for the millions murdered by the Bolsheviks in Russia, even if they have a vague knowledge of the millions suffering under communism. Very few people have an emotional attachment to the victims of the communists because Hollywood and the media have done nothing to instill any concern for them. That's in stark contrast to their unending dirge of the Jewish Holocaust. In the Hollywood media of movies and television and broadcasting and major publishing, every adult has absorbed thousands of hours of what is called the Holocaust. It is the trademarked jealous God which demands no other gods before it. I want to point out that I show a number of pictures of the Holodomor and other victims of Soviet communism, pictures that you're not so familiar with, that they don't show you constantly on television and in the newspapers. I show a picture of an emaciated, beautiful little girl who was starved to death in the intentional ethnic genocide of the Ukrainian people. You don't know her name. You don't know her story. The same Hollywood that brings you the Holocaust almost every day of your life shows you nothing about the largest genocide in the history of mankind. Why? When I met Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he just published his last work called 200 Years Together. It was about the Jewish experience in Russia and contained 3 chapters devoted to discussing the Jewish role in the revolutionary genocide and secret police purges of Soviet Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917. I waited for 10 years in vain for the book to be published in English. It remains unpublished in English to this day. Of course, the secret behind communism must remain a secret to most of the public. Solzhenitsyn knew that he would be condemned for daring to point out the secret, but he went ahead nonetheless, telling me that it was his duty to tell the truth so that the world would know. He paid the price. Although the book was a runaway bestseller in Russia, this last important book by the Nobel Prize-winning author has never been published in English, so the largest audience in the world has been denied the truth. The controlled media had to mute this great man's voice. However, this book, The Secret Behind Communism, will somewhat remedy that suppression, for it contains many important and relevant quotations from 200 Years Together. Many of the revealing quotes that were the reason that the book has not been published fully in English. It wasn't the first time that Solzhenitsyn had raised the subject of the Jewish ethnic driving force behind communism and its slaughters in his famous The Gulag Archipelago books 1, 2, and 3. He described his imprisonment by the Soviets, and he pointed out that almost all the commanders of the Gulag camps were Jews, by famously including pictures, which I show in my book, of 6 Jewish Chekist Gulag bosses of the 1930s. In 200 Years Together, Solzhenitsyn wrote that he had taken their pictures from an official Soviet-era publication which boasted about the gulags. Despite Solzhenitsyn's efforts and those of many others, including Frank Britton, and some of his excellent work and research is included in this volume, the truth about the Jewish supremacist role in the creation, execution, and maintenance of world communism, and the Russian Revolution in particular, remains little known. The reason for this is simple. The Jewish supremacist tribalists who influence major media throughout the West make sure that almost nothing is said about the fact that Jews, along with organized Jewish support worldwide, not only created communism, but were the leaders who brought it into such grim reality. They were indeed the nexus of the greatest slaughter and mass human suffering in history. This is the core of the secret behind communism, exposed and overwhelmingly documented in this book. Next section is the paramount Jewish role in communism, no secret in Israeli media. Ironically, Jewish historians are quite happy to discuss the leading Jewish role among themselves, although any Gentile who dares to raise the topic is immediately decried as a, quote, anti-Semite. A good example came with the article that appeared in the popular Israeli online Jewish Zionist news source called ynetnews.com. In December 2006, it shared an article with its Jewish readers called Stalin's Jews, which tells facts about the Jewish role in the mass murder in Russia that would certainly be criticized as anti-Semitic if any Gentile historian or publication had told these facts. The article, written by well-known Jewish writer Sever Plocher, is subtitled, quote, "We mustn't forget that some of the greatest murderers of modern times were Jewish." It goes on, "We cannot know with certainty the number of deaths Cheka was responsible for in its various manifestations, but the number is surely at least 20 million, including victims of the forced collectivization, the hunger, large purges, expulsions, banishments, executions, and mass death at gulags. Gingrich Yagoda was the greatest Jewish murderer of the 20th century, the GPU's deputy commander, and the founder and commander of the NKVD. Yagoda diligently implemented Stalin's collectivization orders and is responsible for the deaths of at least 10 million people. His Jewish deputies established and managed the Gulag system." Unquote. To understand the incredible level of deception about the enormous Jewish crimes against humanity, just consider how the globalist Jewish-dominated media hides Yagoda's role in a genocide of at least 10 million human beings. Jewish writers in a major Jewish Israeli website casually report to their Jewish readers that the Jewish Bolshevik Yagoda murdered twice the number of the alleged 5.1 million victims counted by the preeminent Holocaust historian Raul Hilberg. Next section. The Holocaust is, quote, never forget. The Bolshevik Holocaust is never remember. This genocidal murderer, who ironically has an identical mustache to Hitler, and who murdered double the number of people than are alleged against Hitler, is completely unknown. Not one person in 1,000 would be able to identify Yagoda's very distinctive name, much less associate it with mass murder. Why does the media tell us that we should never forget the Jewish Holocaust? But in regard to the much bigger Bolshevik Holocaust, the message is never remember. This illustrates the secret behind communism in a more profound way than this author could ever express. Subtitle: Ethnic Hatred Expressed in Both Communism and Zionism. This book exposes the little-known fact that Zionism and communism have the same ethnic and very similar ideological roots. Karl Marx was descended from a long line of Talmudic scholars, and he learned much of his communist theory from Moses Hess. Hess himself later morphed into a rabid Jewish racial supremacist and Zionist, while at the same time continuing to embrace the principles of communism. Tragically, the ethnic cleansings and murderous ways of the Jewish tribalists in Russia are being repeated in the Zionist ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Similar ethnic racism was at work in Palestine as it was in Russia and in other European nations. It can be seen in the ethnic genocide against the Ukrainians. The Jewish Bolsheviks purposely murdered them to reduce their numbers and then flooded their country with non-Ukrainians to destroy their national and ethnic unity. More on this in the Holodomor chapter ahead. Raphael Lemkin, father of the word genocide, wrote this in his article, Soviet Genocide in Ukraine. Quote, "The fourth step in the process, genocide, consisted in the fragmentation of the Ukrainian people at once by the addition to the Ukraine of foreign peoples. In this way, ethnic unity would be destroyed and nationalities mixed. Between 1920 and 1939, the population of Ukraine changed from 80% Ukrainian to only 63%. The Soviet archives in Moscow has this revealing statement from a Bolshevik leader in Ukraine showing the genocide there was to break their ethnic unity in opposition to Bolshevik rule. Quote, "Famine in Ukraine was brought on to decrease the number of Ukrainians, replace the dead with people from other parts of the USSR, and thereby to kill the slightest thought of any Ukrainian independence." This volume reveals how Israel today honors one of the worst Bolshevik criminals of the Second World War, Ilya Ehrenberg, and shows how Zionism embraces the same ethnic hatreds as did their Bolshevik brethren. The next subtitle is "The Israeli Holocaust Museum Honors Bolshevik Promoter of Genocide Who Hid Bolshevik Crimes from the World." Ehrenberg was a leading international propagandist for the Bolshevik state while it committed the worst mass murder in history. He was also the chief propagandist for the Red Army, who urged on the genocidal mass murder of Germans and other Eastern Europeans. The Canadian Jewish News states, quote, "Until his death in 1967, his support for the Soviet state and for Stalin never wavered. His loyalty and service were acknowledged in 1952 when he received the Stalin Prize. He is most infamous for his viciously anti-German wartime propaganda." The Canadian Jewish News states, quote, "As the leading Soviet journalist during World War II, Ehrenberg's writings against the German invaders were circulated among millions of Soviet soldiers. In one booklet called Kill, Ehrenberg incites Soviet soldiers to treat Germans as subhumans. Its final words include the following, quote, "Germans are not human beings. From now on, the word German means to use the most terrible oath. We shall kill. If you have not killed at least one German a day, you have wasted that day. If you cannot kill your German with a bullet, kill him with your bayonet. If there is calm on your part of the front, or if you're waiting for the fighting, kill a German in the meantime. If you leave a German alive, the German will hang a Russian and rape a Russian woman. If you kill one German, kill another. There's nothing more amusing for us than a heap of German corpses. Do not count days. Do not count kilometers. Count only the number of Germans you kill. Kill the German. That is your grandmother's request. Kill the German. That is your child's prayer. Kill the German. That is your motherland's loud request. Kill." Unquote. Ehrenberg's incendiary writing certainly contributed in no small measure to the orgy of murder and rape by Soviet soldiers against German and other Eastern European civilians. I also show a headline from the Daily Mail from historians talking about the mass rape. The headline reads, "Red Army, millions of Eastern Europeans, women and girls raped." The Canadian Jewish News further writes, quote, "The recent disclosure that Ehrenberg arranged to transfer his private papers to Jerusalem's Yad Vashem library and archive while still alive comes as a stunning revelation. Ehrenberg agreed on condition that the transfer and his will remain secret for 20 years after his death." So we discover that a dedicated Bolshevik Soviet leader whose propaganda hid the Bolshevik Holocaust had secretly willed his private papers not to the Soviet Union, but to the Zionist state, where he is honored today at Yad Vashem. The honoring of a genocidal Bolshevik at Yad Vashem, the most important Jewish memorial to the Holocaust, speaks of an enormous hypocrisy that boggles the mind. Only in a deeply corrupted morality could the most important memorial in the world against genocide honor a man who supported genocide. More importantly, there is not a word of criticism in the press. It seems that one man's genocidal maniac is another man's hero. Zionist Israel today honors leaders who openly promote ethnic genocide in words just as horrific as Ehrenberg's. The former chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, calls for the extermination of the Palestinians. BBC quotes him in the following, quote, "It is forbidden to be merciful to them. You must send missiles to them and annihilate them. They are evil and damnable." He was quoted as saying in a sermon delivered on Monday to mark the Jewish festival of Passover, quote, "The Lord shall return the Arabs' deeds on their own heads, waste their seed and exterminate them, devastate them, and banish them from the world," he said. Rabbi Yosef is the spiritual head of the powerful Shas party, one of the Israeli prime minister's closest allies. He also has said that the, quote, "the only purpose of Gentiles on earth is to serve Jews." Now, could one even imagine the world outrage if any political leader in America or Europe was in political partnership with someone who preaches that Jews must be exterminated? This alone reveals Zionist power in government and media across the world. Why there is vast knowledge and emotional attachment to a Holocaust perpetrated against Jews, and so little attention on a larger Holocaust perpetrated by Jews, is clear. It's a result of Jewish influence in media and government. We must increase our knowledge and our passion for all victims of genocide. I begin with a short chapter from my book, Jewish Supremacism, for an introduction to the shocking historical data. After completing The Secret, I urge you to read Jewish Supremacism completely for a deeper understanding of Jewish ethnic racism and extremism. Then I explore a wealth of material that has gone down what George Orwell called the memory hole in his classic novel, 1984. I share with you some of Frank Britton's groundbreaking research on the topic, first published in 1952 and supplemented since that time, including my additions and updates. And then I delve into my own research into the topic and that of many other scholars. This book seeks to answer crucial questions. Why has there been such a close relationship between Jewish tribalism and communism all over the world? For at first glance, the two movements would seem to be incompatible. How does one explain rich capitalist Zionists supporting communist atheist movements? How and why did communist Jews who worship Trotsky morph into so-called neoconservatives? Zionists support a state based on ethnic supremacism. Israel promotes Jewish-only immigration, one of the strictest immigration policies on earth. Israel promotes segregated schools and housing between Jews and non-Jews. Israel does not even allow a marriage to be performed between a Jew and a Gentile. It allows its citizens to own and even carry machine guns on the street. However, those same Zionists who support Israel overwhelmingly support the opposite political agenda in every nation in which they dwell. They overwhelmingly support leftist and Marxist movements and ideologies in the Gentile nations in which they live. Still today, decades after losing control of communist Russia. Why? Zionist influence over American and EU policy directly led to the Zionist ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and the death and suffering of millions of innocents in Zionist Jewish tribalist-driven wars in the Middle East. What do these events and the communist genocides have in common? The racial hatred behind the genocides of the Jewish Bolsheviks must also be examined and fully understood. Can one understand the crimes of Zionism without seeing their relationship to the crimes of communism? The Bolshevik Holocaust is a horrific story that all people who love life and freedom must learn about if they're not to be doomed to repeat similar horrors. If the world had been aware of the Jewish tribalist forces behind communism and their role in the most massive violation of human rights in all of history, certainly the world could have averted their crimes in modern times. Preventing the wars that they've orchestrated in the Middle East would have saved millions of lives. Much of the Zionist techniques of terrorism, ethnic cleansing, torture, and murder in Palestine and across the region were learned long before in their Bolshevik revolt against civilization. Unmasking the ethnic tribalism and ethnic hatred behind the Bolshevik Holocaust may be critical to preventing a globalist tyranny and future genocides. You may ask, how so? It is because the same ethnic tribalism that was behind the Red Terror may have ultimately lost in Russia, but they have in many ways gained a degree of global supremacy today. So exposing them is crucial. They are the source of Zionism, and they still, for the most part, control the remnants of communism. They dominate the nexus of global media, government, and finance. Learning the historical truth about communism and its crimes against humanity is essential to make sure that history does not repeat itself. Indeed, to make sure that these perpetrators do not repeat their crimes upon we the living and upon our children. In the next few pages, you will delve deep into the secret behind communism. We need your help to publish this book. We don't have a big Zionist-controlled publisher that can print many tens of thousands of copies to make the price very low, so we need your help because book publishing depends on having a larger run to get the price to be reasonable. Plus, we want to distribute this vital book to many important opinion leaders and leaders in our society that need to get this information, because we all have to realize the threat of international Zionism, the Zionist globalism that threatens our freedoms, our economic well-being, our heritage, and everything that it means in terms of human rights. You can go to davidduke.com, and I ask you to please, right away, before you let it slip your mind, make a donation to help in the publishing of this book. And by the way, anyone who gives a gift of $100 or more will receive a numbered, authenticated, and personally autographed book that will certainly gain much value in years ahead. I look forward to hearing from you, and thank you so much for your support in getting out the truth about not just Zionism, but about the forces that have created the Zio-globalism today. To understand that, you must understand the secret behind communism. Thanks for being with me.